What I am about to tell you has been verified by 3 separate witnesses, documented in police reports that were later sealed, and confirmed by a medical examiner who resigned from his position 48 hours after the incident, and has refused to speak publicly ever since. The body of Marcus Webb had been cut open on a stainless steel table, his organs removed, weighed, catalogued, and placed in biohazard containers. His brain had been sectioned, his blood had been drained, his chest cavity had been emptied, and then sewn shut with the thick black thread that morticians use when they no longer expect their patients to complain. Marcus Webb was dead. Marcus Webb had been dead for 6 days when they found him walking through Brennan Woods with leaves in his hair and dirt beneath his fingernails, asking strangers if they knew how to get back to his house because he could not remember the way home. The first person to see him was a teenager named Casey Morrison, who had been smoking cigarettes behind the old water treatment plant, a spot where kids went to avoid their parents and the security cameras that seemed to multiply in town every year. Casey heard footsteps in the dead leaves, slow and shuffling, and assumed it was another student or maybe one of the homeless men who sometimes camped near the creek. When she turned around and saw the man standing between 2 birch trees, her first thought was that he looked confused. Her second thought was that he looked wrong. His skin had a grayish undertone that she initially attributed to the overcast sky. His eyes seemed unfocused, staring through her rather than at her. He was wearing a dark suit that appeared to be covered in soil, and something that looked disturbingly like dried grass. Casey asked if he was okay. The man opened his mouth to respond, and she noticed that his lips were cracked and colorless, almost like rubber that had been left in the sun too long. He asked her if she knew where Maple Street was. Casey knew Maple Street. Everyone in town knew Maple Street, because the Webb family had lived there for 3 generations. She also knew Marcus Webb because she had attended his funeral 5 days earlier. Her mother had made her go because Marcus had been her elementary school bus driver years ago, and the whole town had turned out to pay respects to a man who had died unexpectedly in his sleep at the age of 54. Casey had seen the casket lowered into the ground. She had watched his widow throw the first handful of dirt. She had heard the pastor say ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Now that same man was standing 15 feet away from her, asking for directions home as if nothing had happened, as if he had simply gotten lost on an evening walk rather than gotten lost in whatever comes after breathing stops. She ran. Casey Morrison ran faster than she had ever run in her life, and she did not stop until she reached the parking lot of the grocery store on 5th Avenue, where she collapsed against a shopping cart corral and called her mother, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Her mother thought she was having a panic attack or that something had happened with the boy. When Casey finally managed to explain what she had seen, her mother drove to pick her up immediately and took her home and gave her tea and assured her that grief does strange things to the mind. But Casey knew what she had seen. She knew the difference between a living person and whatever Marcus Webb had become. The second sighting happened 2 hours later, and it was not a traumatized teenager this time. It was Gerald Patterson, a retired police officer who had spent 31 years on the force and had seen enough crime scenes to fill a textbook on human cruelty. Gerald was walking his German Shepherd along the trail that bordered Brennan Woods when the dog suddenly stopped, raised its hackles, and began to growl at something in the trees. Gerald had learned long ago to trust his dog's instincts, so he unholstered the personal weapon he still carried out of habit and called out to whoever was there to show themselves. The figure that emerged from the shadows made Gerald's blood turn to ice water. He recognized Marcus Webb immediately because he had known the man for over 20 years. They had played poker together once a month for the better part of a decade. Gerald had been one of the pallbearers at the funeral. He had helped carry that casket on his shoulder and had felt the weight of the body inside. Now Marcus was walking toward him with that same confused expression Casey had described, that same distant look in his eyes like a man trying to remember a word that was on the tip of his tongue. Gerald's dog was barking furiously, straining against the leash, desperate to either attack or flee. Marcus stopped about 10 feet away and tilted his head slightly to one side. He asked Gerald if he had seen his wife because he could not seem to find her anywhere. Gerald noticed the thick black stitches running up the center of his old friend's chest, visible through the gap in his shirt where one of the buttons had come undone. Gerald Patterson did not run. He was not a man who ran from anything. Instead, he backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact, his gun still raised, but his finger off the trigger because some deep primal part of his brain understood that bullets would not help him here. When he reached his truck, he drove directly to the police station and demanded to speak with someone in charge. The officers on duty thought he was drunk until they noticed his hands were shaking so badly he could not hold a cup of water. Gerald Patterson had never shaken in his life. He had been shot twice in the line of duty and had not shaken. He had delivered death notifications to grieving families and had not shaken. But something about the way Marcus Webb had looked at him, something about the emptiness behind those familiar eyes, had broken something fundamental in his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The third witness was a woman named Ellen Cho, who ran the bakery on Commerce Street. She had closed shop for the evening and was taking the garbage out to the dumpster in the alley behind the building when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned and saw a man in a dirty suit walking toward her with an uneven gait, his feet dragging slightly with each step as if he had forgotten exactly how legs were supposed to work. Ellen did not recognize him at first because she had only moved to town a year ago, but she immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The man's movements were mechanical, stuttering like a marionette being controlled by someone who had never operated one before. When he got close enough for her to see his face, she noticed that his skin had a waxy quality and that there was a Y-shaped scar on his chest that she could see through his shirt. The man stopped in front of her and asked if she knew where Maple Street was. His voice sounded dry and unused, like he was speaking through vocal cords that had not produced sound in quite some time. Ellen pointed down the street and told him it was about 6 blocks south. The man thanked her politely and continued walking in the direction she had indicated. It was only later, after she heard about the other sightings, and after the police came to interview her, that Ellen realized she had been giving directions to a dead man. She closed her bakery for a week after that and seriously considered moving back to the city, where the horrors were at least comprehensible. The police did not want to investigate at first because the claims being made were impossible. Dead men do not walk. Bodies that have been autopsied do not ask for directions. But too many credible witnesses were saying the same thing, and eventually a patrol unit was dispatched to check on the Webb family residence at 47 Maple Street. What they found there has never been officially released to the public. but the officers involved both requested transfers to different departments within the month, and one of them left law enforcement entirely to become a long-haul trucker, a job where he could drive through the night and never have to stop anywhere for too long. The front door of the Webb house was standing open when the officers arrived. They called out to identify themselves and received no response. They entered with their weapons drawn, sweeping each room according to their training, and found nothing disturbed on the first floor. The living room was neat and orderly. The kitchen showed signs of a normal dinner having been prepared. It was only when they climbed the stairs to the second floor that they heard the sound. It was a voice, dry and cracked, repeating the same phrase over and over again. The voice was coming from the master bedroom at the end of the hall. They found Marcus Webb sitting on the edge of the bed he had shared with his wife for 23 years. His wife, Helen, was lying on the bed behind him, her body cold and stiff, her face frozen in an expression that the officers would later describe as pure terror. She had been dead for at least a day, possibly longer. There were no signs of violence on her body. The medical examiner who later examined her could not determine an exact cause of death, but noted that her heart had simply stopped, as if it had been shocked beyond its capacity to continue beating. Marcus was holding her hand when the officers found him. He was repeating the same phrase again and again. He kept saying that he had come home, but she would not wake up. He kept saying that he had been trying to wake her up for hours, but she would not open her eyes. The officers did not know what to do. They had not been trained for this. No one had ever been trained for this. They called for backup, and the backup called for more backup, and eventually there were nearly a dozen police vehicles outside the Webb residence, their lights painting the neighborhood in alternating shades of red and blue. The ambulance that arrived refused to transport Marcus Webb because the paramedics who examined him could not find a pulse. They could not find respiration. They could not find any of the vital signs that would indicate a living human being. And yet Marcus continued to sit on that bed, holding his dead wife's hand, asking why she would not wake up. Eventually, they made the decision to contact the medical examiner who had performed the original autopsy on Marcus Webb 6 days earlier. His name was Dr. Richard Crane, and he arrived at the scene with a face the color of old paper. He had performed thousands of autopsies in his career. He had removed Marcus Webb's heart and held it in his hands. He had sliced open Marcus Webb's brain and examined the tissue under a microscope. He had signed the death certificate. He had declared that Marcus Webb had died of a massive cardiac event and that there was no foul play involved. Now he was standing in a bedroom looking at his former patient, watching those empty eyes blink slowly, watching that sutured chest rise and fall in a mockery of breathing. Dr. Crane resigned the next morning. He never gave an explanation. He moved to another state and changed his phone number. Marcus Webb was taken into custody, though no one could agree on whether custody was even the appropriate term for what was happening. He was transported to a facility that no one will publicly acknowledge exists, a place where the government keeps things that cannot be explained and should not be discussed. His body was examined by specialists whose names are classified and whose findings have never been released. The house on Maple Street was sold at auction to a buyer from out of state who planned to tear it down and build something new. The grave where Marcus Webb had been buried was quietly exhumed during the night, and witnesses say the casket that was pulled from the ground was empty except for a pillow and the fragments of fingernails embedded in the satin lining. But the story does not end there, because stories like this never really end. They just fade into rumor and legend and late-night conversations whispered between people who are afraid to admit what they believe. Hikers in Brennan Woods still report seeing a figure moving between the trees after dark, a man in a dirty suit who walks with a shuffling gait and asks strangers for directions to Maple Street. Some people dismiss these sightings as hoaxes or hallucinations. Others who remember what happened that autumn know better. They keep their doors locked after sunset. They do not walk alone near the woods. They understand that the boundary between the living and the dead is perhaps not as solid as we would like to believe. The medical examiner's reports from that week have been sealed indefinitely. The police officers who responded to the initial calls have all moved away or passed on, and the few who remain refuse to discuss what they witnessed. Casey Morrison, the teenager who first saw Marcus Webb walking through those woods, is now a woman in her 30s with children of her own. She has never told them the full story of what she saw that day, but she has taught them to never go into Brennan Woods alone, and to always trust their instincts when something feels wrong. She still has nightmares sometimes, dreams where she is standing among the birch trees, and a man in a dark suit is walking toward her, his cracked lips moving, asking the same question again and again. Where is Maple Street? Where is his wife? Why will no one help him find his way home? There are some who believe that Marcus Webb was the victim of something beyond human understanding, some force or entity that pulled him back from wherever the dead are supposed to go. Others believe that he never really died at all, that his death was some kind of elaborate hoax or medical mistake that no one wants to admit. But the people who saw him, the ones who looked into those empty eyes and heard that dry voice and watched that sutured chest move in that terrible parody of life, they know the truth even if they cannot explain it. Marcus Webb died. Marcus Webb was autopsied. Marcus Webb was buried in a cemetery on the edge of town with a headstone that listed his dates of birth and death. And 3 days after his organs were removed and catalogued and disposed of according to standard protocol, Marcus Webb was found walking through Brennan Woods, looking for his wife, trying to find his way back to a life that had already ended. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some graves cannot hold what is placed inside them. And some questions have answers that we are not meant to understand. The only certainty in this story is that it happened, that multiple witnesses confirmed it, that official records were sealed to prevent the public from knowing the truth. Believe what you want about the nature of life and death and whatever lies beyond the veil that separates them. But if you ever find yourself walking near Brennan Woods after dark, and you hear footsteps shuffling through the leaves behind you, do not turn around. Do not answer if someone asks you for directions. Just walk as fast as you can toward the lights of town and do not look back, because some of the lost can never be found again, and some of the dead are still searching for a home they can no longer reach.